Hello and welcome to Prince George Up Close. My name is Grant Bachand, and today we are going to be speaking with the president of the National Firearms Association and an instructor at the College of New Caledonia. He also ran in the most recent federal election. Mr. Sheldon Clare, how are you doing today, sir?
Pretty well, Grant. Glad to be here.
So, as I was saying, you ran in the last election. How are things going since since the election's over now?
Well, October 20th, 2015, I was back in class.
You were basically rolling with it as it was.
Absolutely, yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, I was right back at everything else I do.
What do you think about the results so far, and how, looking back on the election, how do you feel that the Liberals are doing so far?
The results, you mean federally, locally?
Federally. We'll say federally.
Well, I found the results somewhat disappointing. I don't know what would have made me very happy in the greater scheme of things. I think that the jury's still out about what's going on with the new government and how they're going to perform. I've found some of their announcements and pronouncements to be somewhat disappointing.
Like which ones?
Well, the National Economic, the NEP on carbon, for example, is shades of Trudeau the First, and I'm a little concerned about what that's going to mean for the resource extraction provinces. I think that when you start talking about taxing carbon, what you're really talking about is taxing and getting more money out of the hands of people for government, whether that's transferred back to the provinces or not. And I don't believe that people really see that as being helpful to increasing spending and benefiting the economy. And I certainly don't think that it's going to help any aspect of the environment or climate change. It's just transferring money around. It doesn't have anything to do with solving what is the perceived problem.
It's like a revenue generator for the government.
It's a revenue generator for the government, and it's not going to be a revenue generator for the average Canadian.
But here in a local level, we have two new conservative, or not two new, we have Todd Doherty and we have Bob Zimmer, who are two conservative MPs. How do you feel about their election into office? And
well, both of them seem to be quite vigorous. I've actually talked to a few people who have been quite pleased that the two representatives are being very, very rigorous. And I think the election here did make them pay a lot of attention to this riding. I mean, Todd's been going back and forth on a regular basis. He's got to have more air miles racked up than anybody ever. In the trips I've been taking for the National Firearms Association, I frequently run into our representatives in the airports, and I'm pleased to see that they're out engaging with their constituents. That's what the job is.
And Todd is now a critic of the Ministry of Fisheries. I don't think I'm right about that one. He's a critic, though. He's a shadow.
Yeah,
he's shadow cabinet now.
Yes. He's gotten that, and more power to him. You know that anything that helps the riding is going to be beneficial to us out here.
But when we think about basically after the election, we have also seen a couple interesting things come up. So we've seen the new LNG facility be put forward and approved by the federal government for Prince Rupert. So that's obviously got to be an interesting economic boost for our region. When you think about it yourself, if you were to be in government right now, how do you feel about the LNG facility?
Well, I think LNG is important, and I think it's useful, but I'm a little concerned we may have missed the boat, that opportunities in Asia have already attracted those markets. Those markets will one day come to us, but I'm not sure that we're seeing the economic benefit of that
They're more North Dakota and all that sort of areas, right?
Well, yeah, and I really believe we need to diversify our economy. We've talked about this before, of course, but relying just on resource extraction is risky, especially if you narrowly focus on a few different individual types of resource. And if something happens in the world market, then you're left with a significant downturn in your economy and no way to bounce back easily.
But BC's been doing not half bad though on the provincial scale. If we look at, say, Alberta, which has been really struggling ever since the oil downturn, and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and even Ontario with their massive debt load. BC seems to be the one province kind of keeping their head above water right now.
We seem to be holding our own. there are some things that, of course, some aspects of our community and society are not happy with, some of the choices made by the current government. But economically, we seem to be doing not great, but okay. And that's probably the best we can hope for given the current global situation, which doesn't seem to be great.
Yeah, it seems to be in a bit of a lull right now.
Yes, it does.
So turning back to our riding in northern BC, Bob Zimmer brought forward a petition to have the AR-15 reclassified from restricted to non-restricted. And Ralph Goodale, who is the Minister of Public Safety, he didn't get on side with that. He didn't like that idea. Where do you come in on this AR-15 talk?
Well, the National Firearms Association actually put forth a much more thorough petition with the old style of petition submission a year or so before. And we also did one on eliminating the magazine capacity restrictions, because the research in Canada is pretty clear that none of it makes any difference to crime rates, violence, or any aspect of preventing bad people from doing bad things.
Yeah.
And all that is done is tried to put out a false sense of feel good and pretend that we're safe, when it really has nothing whatsoever to do with any aspect of that.
But there is a little bit of fear, though. You would say, like the AR-15. Bob, he had a really terrible timing with his petition, especially with the Pulse nightclub shooting in the United States, and it just seemed to just tarnish the debate altogether right off the bat.
Well, I think it's a red herring to say that the tool is the cause of the problem. The AR-15 was originally made as a civilian sporting rifle. It was later adapted for military purposes. So people say, well, it's a military rifle and it's been this and that. Well, AR stands for Armalite. It doesn't stand for anything else that anyone might say. It's the most popular sporting firearm in North America today. It's very popular in Canada for sport shooting. It's been restricted. People used to be able to hunt with them. It was made restricted for a short period of time. Then it was non-restricted for several years. Then the Conservatives, with Mulroney and Campbell, turned it back to restricted, and it's remained to that status to this day. It's an artificial construct. It does nothing to prevent anyone from doing bad things with anything.
If someone wants to cause crime, they'll get their hands with their guns.
Yeah, they can go on Facebook or Instagram and put a meme up of a clown, for example, cost thousands of dollars of police resources, and tie up all sorts of people with running around looking for a problem that really isn't there. So, what do you do with this, right?
Yeah.
You just have to stop people from, or discourage people from doing stupid and ignorant and dumb things by getting them educated.
It's almost though, when you think about these sort of things, it's amazing what one person, how they can impact the collective so much more now in society. And even with these guns, there is that concern that, you know, the individual is able to do so much more if we give if we don't, like the United States seems to have a problem with guns. And
I don't think it does have a problem with firearms.
Okay.
It's a bit of a myth, and I mean, far be it from me to step into the role of defending the Americans and their circumstances and situation, but we do see a lot of sensationalizing of events. But when you look at the American population, which is huge, it's more than 10 times our own population, and you see actually a very few number of incidents and events considering the high number of firearms ownership.
Okay.
The Americans are not the leading area of the world that has these shootings or any crime activities. There were more in Europe in the last 5 years than there were in the United States. So I mean, when you, in terms of numbers of people affected.
Okay.
So when you start looking at the research and the details, and there's some pretty good research on it, you actually find that a lot of it has been sensationalized. And when you go to the cold, hard facts and the stats, which many people who make emotional arguments, shallow emotional arguments, find unpalatable, you find that the folks from my side of the bench tend to be the ones who are correct.
There tends to be, though, I think, and you hear this in popular culture, the arguments, and this is purely United States sort of talking here of it's their gun rights. You know, gun rights seems to be the term that they talk a lot about, but we don't seem to have that gun rights sort of ideology here because we don't have the Second Amendment here in Canada.
Well, that's fair. However, I think it's also important to understand that the United States and Canada are children of the same parent. It used to be called New England down there for a reason.
Yeah.
And it was New France up here for a reason as well, until it all became British North America.
Yeah.
And the children of the same parent got a lot of their constitutional background from the history of Britain and England specifically. So rights to property are something that tend to be more on the right of the political spectrum than the left. So you tend to see more support for things like the right to property, and firearms rights are ultimately a property right, and thus they are disparaged often by parties from the center and left.
And so there tends to be, though, we talked about these emotional arguments that some people are making on the left, and there are probably some arguments that are made on the right that are emotional as well. Keep in mind.
Emotional arguments do not have an ideology.
Exactly. What do you say to people who are on your side of the bench when you hear them saying to have that conversation, have that dialogue about gun rights, or gun ownership, and more opening up of those sort of things with people who don't agree with them, who oppose them? How do you have that conversation?
I tend not to waste my time too much with people who are vehemently opposed, because I'm not going to change their minds.
Yeah, but maybe even like moderates, say.
Oh, moderates I'm happy to work with. Moderates are usually basing their opinion on what they've heard or read in the media without having direct experience. So you enable people to have direct experiences, and you find they can be quite a bit more interested. I mean, when the folks from Vice Media came out and talked to me during the election, they wanted me to do they had a particular image they wanted me to portray, and I refused to buy into that. And what I did is I created the image that I wanted them to buy into. I took them out to a well set up biathlon range and took them shooting, and they were hitting targets and having fun, and you could see it, and they were surprised at that.
There was a connection that was.
They made a connection, and I got a pretty positive interview out of that. I was pretty pleased with the result.
I remember seeing that interview too. It was a very good one, actually.
Well, it's quite different than a lot of the ones that Vice does of candidates and people.
Yeah.
And my previous interviews with them have not been along that vein. But the fact is that I'm prepared to give them a shot.
More demonization, would you say?
Well, I don't know that.
Because they seem to like to demonize people.
Yes, that's true, and that certainly didn't happen in this case. And that may well have been part of what their objectives were, because they were looking at demonizing others rather than me.
Than you, yeah.
The friend of my enemy is my friend kind of a relationship, I suppose. But on the other hand, they were a little bit nervous, and they had a vision they wanted, and I wasn't going to give them that vision. I gave them the vision that I wanted.
So when you think about the National Firearms Association and the initiatives that you guys are doing, what are some of the goals and what are some of the initiatives you're currently proposing? You talked about the magazine as being one of them. You talked about the petition for the AR-15. What are some of the other ones that you guys are pushing forward right now?
Well, we've been pretty active at the United Nations. You may be aware of that. We actually have a representative heading to the UN next week to make a brief presentation. I myself have been active in UN meetings this year. I was in Geneva in August at the Conference of States Parties to the Arms Trade Treaty, and I made a presentation. I was the only representative of a firearms organization to speak at that particular meeting, and I knew I had to be there to challenge what was going to be the changing Canadian position, which was announced at that meeting, and that we exchanged business cards and had a good chat, and as well I went to New York to talk at the Arms Trade Treaty there as well, and we've been pretty vigorous about trying to make sure that we're connected with our worldwide allies and that we're challenging efforts worldwide against us. And there are a lot of people who really don't like civilians owning firearms, period, full stop. They don't care that you're a hunter or an owner of a shotgun, or you just want to go out and pot a grouse every now and then. It's all, as far as they're concerned, many of them, it's all bad.
Yeah.
And they may couch their words a little bit to make it sound like they're doing, that's not what they're after. But the evidence is otherwise. And I mean, the Secretary General of the UN himself talked about registering and confiscating firearms when he addressed the General Assembly just over a year ago, the Security Council just over a year ago. And do they think that doesn't get back to us and our people? I mean, it does. Our members hear these things, and they call us, and they're concerned, and they're worried.
So the general tide seems to be more for gun registration, more for gun, I would say, seizure. Would that be, that seems to be the tide that the international community is taking?
Well, I think the problem is you've got big problems in the world that aren't easily fixed. And what you try to do is that you go to the low-hanging fruit to make people feel like something's being done.
Guns are easy.
And yeah, and civilian firearms owners are an easy target. And they've been vilified really since the 1960s in North America, and that isn't a fair characterization. So there's a real need for people who are firearms owners to get involved with their local firearms club, to join associations that support their point of view, and to make sure that they're in connection with their elected representatives. And that's one of the main things we encourage people to do is if you want to be governed by others, well, you just have to sit home and do nothing. If you want to be a part of society and show value in your community, you need to be involved.
So for yourself personally, where would you like to see, and obviously this is probably an ongoing thing, but where would you like to see the future of gun laws in Canada go? What's your ambitions and your hopes in that department?
Well, my ambitions and hopes would be to see a return to sanity and common sense, an elimination of a tremendous amount of unnecessary red tape. There was a study published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence by Dr. Kaylin Longman, MD, PhD, who was an emergency physician and an instructor at Queen's, who decided to look into government waste projects because he was trying to find money for his hospital to get things like MRIs and other equipment which would actually save lives. And he was being turned down for grants, and he said, well, there must be government waste somewhere that I can look into it. Oh, I've heard this firearm system is a waste, so I'm going to look into that. So he examined Canadian firearms laws from the 1970s forward to I think the year it went to was 2007, which is the last time there's been any significant change. And he analyzed all the government statistics and information and all the government data. He used a multivariate approach, and what he found is that none of that has made any difference to crime rates. None of it has made any difference to rates of assault, spousal violence, anything like that. The only thing that has seemed to have had an effect upon our lowered crime rates, and crime rates have been dropping, and crimes of violence with firearms have been steadily dropping, and they're not affected by the laws, is that the population demographic has changed. You don't have as many young men, which are the primary group that tend to be engaged in risky behaviors. There are fewer and fewer of them. They've aged, or
the boomers have gone through.
The boomers have gone through is the short version of that, and that seems to be the cause of it, because there's always crime, and there are always people who are going to engage in crime.
So you're more or less saying that we would want to see like a pullback generally of that whole system.
Absolutely. I mean, people do understand the need to make sure that that person standing in front of you isn't someone who's a bad person. So one of the things we've proposed over time is to have a prohibited persons list. So if the person comes in and they want to buy something that could be perceived as dangerous, whatever it might be, is that they are run through that check. And if they're on the list, the answer is no. And it's innocent until proven guilty in my mind. And I think that's the tack that we need to return to. It's a time-honored way of honoring individual and civil rights.
So this is like a prohibited list of people who would say have committed violent crimes in the past and
demonstrated a propensity for violence, demonstrated by their actions or behaviors that they're unstable, or they're engaged in risky behavior that shows that they may be prone to doing something dangerous or stupid.
And this actually would be interesting is when thinking about that sort of stuff, we have this gentleman, or this, I think he was a young guy that was in Ontario who was on a peace bond, who was going to cause some trouble on a Ontario transit system, but he wasn't arrested, or at least from what I've read, he wasn't arrested. But so he didn't have a record, but he was planning to do something. With those sort of people who we kind of have these terrorist inclinations, it seems to be the general theme that's been going on is terrorist inclinations. We suspect they might be someone.
Well, you have to be careful about that. I mean, you find these things like no-fly lists and people getting getting targeted for very, very sketchy reasons. And I think that if you put someone on a list, you have to be really clear about it, that make sure their rights are protected as well.
Yeah.
You can't just arbitrarily do this. There has to be a due process associated with such things.
Due process. Where do you come in when we think about mental health in this situation, and lots of situations with our gun regulations? Do they not prevent people who have severe mental health situations going on? That they kind
Well,
of
there are means of stopping people who are dangerously violent with mental health problems. But I think it's really important to recognize that most people who have mental health issues are not dangerous to themselves or anyone else. Yeah, and I think that's important to say. It's a very small number of people who are dangerous in society. I mean, I think if it was not the case, this would be quite a different world that we lived in.
Yeah, there'd be a lot more.
There would be a lot more of this kind of thing that people perceive to be problematic. More incidents of crazy driving or other silliness that is unnecessary.
When we think about 2017 and the provincial election, what are your thoughts going into like the NDP, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the Greens, and the whole world that the 2017 election is going to be like?
Well, I think a lot of what the 2017 election is going to be like is about the economy. I think that there are a lot of people who are concerned about resource extraction. They want to make sure that it's done responsibly, and yet it has to happen in order to make BC a strong, vibrant economy. And when people are going to make their choices, they're going to analyze the political parties based on how they see that those parties will best represent them and their needs and ensure that there is long-term viable employment, educational opportunities, and the possibility for people to make real contributions to their society.
But you're in education, you're an instructor at a college, and one of the, I guess, complaints levied against the Liberals has been their cutting of the educational budgets.
That is a problem. Absolutely. I think that the cuts to education have been highly problematic. I've seen a fair bit of that up close, how tight they pare things. But it does come down to how you budget. And when you have a limited amount of funds, one must determine what's going to be the most valuable. Are you going to cut this, or are you going to cut that? And it comes down to how you spend your money, Grant. You've got to really measure it. It's like running your house.
Yeah.
What do you spend your money on?
Is a deficit and is debt a big deal, and should we approach and attack that right off the bat, or can we just run that debt right up?
Debt, in my view, getting rid of the debt is a huge concern. You have to deal with debt, because debt becomes such a burden that it drives up every other expense. When you start having to pay interest on debt, and you look at how much that interest is, you could run every social program or fund any device you wanted to, and you'd be in great shape if you got rid of the debt.
Yeah.
But you can't just eliminate the debt by waving your hands. It takes hard work, it takes commitment from all levels of society, and it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
And doing deficit funding is a problem. You cannot run deficits in order to run your economy and make people happy with short-term bribes. You've got to make those hard choices, and sometimes people don't like those choices.
Well, the current Liberals seem to want to approach the Keynesian economic sort of strategy of this sort of situation here.
Well, that's interesting, because John Maynard Keynes was a British liberal economist who was not very well liked by the right.
No.
His economic positions are generally seen as radical and left wing. However, such an economist as Stephen Harper was a full-on embracer of Keynesian economic theory and used Keynesian theory in most of his economic decisions through his entire time in office. So I find that kind of amusing and interesting that John Maynard Keynes seems to be the run-to solution for governments of all stripes nowadays.
So I guess finally what I'd like to end off in is thinking about your future. You ran in politics. Is there any future? Is there another Sheldon Clare going at the heap again there?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's very difficult for anyone to win as an independent. I knew that going in. I was hoping to get above 1%. You know, you pump up the whole thing, of course, when you're doing this, because if you don't, why are you running?
Yeah.
And I did achieve getting over 1%, which was a significant goal. And the other thing is, I think I added to the level of the debate. I raised issues that may not have been raised otherwise, and I called people out on things when they needed to be called out.
And sometimes that just needs to happen. Right?
I think it made it a better election, and I think that the people of Caribou, Prince George are benefiting from it. And I did talk to the winner of that election, Todd Doherty, about this, and he said, you know, Sheldon, I really respect every person who ran. And he said, I own the responsibility of winning every day. And I thought, okay, Todd, that's good enough for me. You know, if you understand that, you're working hard to represent your constituents, and that's a good thing.
So you feel that the Conservatives are doing a good job right now, and at least they're on the right
well,
direction?
I have concerns about some things. I'm always happy. I have concerns with all the political parties. I've been very independent about such things, and willing to speak my mind. Sometimes that goes over well, and frankly, sometimes it doesn't. But if I was afraid of speaking my mind, I think I'd be living in the wrong country.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, Sheldon. I appreciate you coming on the show and talking with us about these issues and what you've been up to ever since the election.
Well, like I said, I went right back to work, focusing on my daughters, and I've been engaging with the local biathlon group at the Caledonia Nordic Ski Club. We're hosting the Nationals here next year, the North American Championships. It's going to be a really big event in March. So I'm helping out with that as much as I can, and just keeping busy. National Firearms Association, of course, is keeping me very busy.
One would assume so. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on.
It was great. Real pleasure.
Our thanks to Sheldon Clare. Let me know who you want to see on the show by tweeting me at Grant Bachand. Till next time, thanks for watching.